fat, saturated fat, protein that stayed about the same. So low fat, low fat, low fat was the government mantra. Push private industry to come out with hundreds of low fat foods because, gosh, they've got an emergency. Scientists said, look, we don't have definitive evidence. The McGovern Commission says we don't have time for more evidence. People are dying. So we got the federal guidelines. You can read about this history on the Nutrition Coalition website and other websites, nutritioncoalition.us. Poor metabolic health fueled the pandemic. Most people with severe critical COVID were obese, diabetic, or with hypertension. Many that weren't overweight, they had underlying metabolic health conditions, TOEFL, thin on the outside, but high visceral fat. Those are caused, critics say, by the food we eat, by the food the government tells us to eat. This is in the news right now where the American Heart Association came out with a new study saying fasting is killing people. That data is flat wrong. You can look at it and see where they got it. It's an associational study. I'll put a link to it. But really, we want to understand why so many people are diabetic, have type 2 diabetes. My father had and suffered for decades, and I had pre-diabetes. Following the government guidelines, the guidelines for the American Diabetes Association is a cause of diabetes, right? What diabetics, obese people are served in hospitals and nursing homes, adult care homes is a cause of diabetes. It makes it worse. They're served food that are high carbohydrate because they're following the federal guidelines. Gary Taubes, in his latest book, Rethinking Diabetes, he says we need to look at these theories. Again, Nina Teicholz and Gary Taubes, they're not scientists, they're science journalists, but they're citing the leading scientists, the publications. Gary Taubes' book on this, 2008, following a New York Times Magazine article, What If It's Been a Big Fat Lie? Nina Teicholz' 2015 book, The Big Fat Surprise. Butter, meat, cheese belong in a healthy diet. Eggs are healthy. The government was saying, don't eat eggs. They've got saturated fat. So people who followed what the federal government said got sicker, high blood pressure, a whole range of things because of the guidelines. So our economy gets unhealthy following energy guidelines. Our body gets unhealthy following body energy guidelines, food guidelines. So now it's a booming, now two things are going on. People are taking drugs, metformin, and getting injected insulin to deal with their diabetes. But in reality now there's a booming, hundreds of direct primary care doctors are prescribing dietary changes. Stop eating sugar for a few days, your blood glucose normalizes. Stop eating carbs, which turn to glucose in your body. Your blood glucose normalizes. In a few weeks or months, most people, they can be carefully de-prescribed, reducing their high blood pressure medication, reducing metformin, coming off of insulin. I mean, the Dr. Unwin, others are publishing on this. It's astonishing, but it's sort of hidden. It's invisible in public schools. You can't get healthy food, I would argue. Instead, you get food that follows the federal dietary guidelines. And maybe it's not enough money to be cooked or prepared. So now there's dozens of books and conferences. I went to Keto Salt Lake conference a couple years ago. I went to Low Carb Denver. I missed attending some of the other metabolic health conferences in Florida and California. But in each of these, there are dozens and dozens of high-end medical researchers and doctors discussing their findings in their practice, in their clinic, in their research about how to get healthy by changing what you eat. Critics say there were no randomized control trials. For example, changing your diet can improve your mental health, but no RCT trials because none were funded. There were no low-carb studies funded from the 1980s to 2002, according to Eric Westman. So yeah, they didn't have randomized control trials because they couldn't get funding. All the funding was for associational trials that pushed the status quo federal guidelines. And how did this all start? Ansel Keys, the 7-country study, he went around the world. He published a study. He said, look, in these 7 countries, they have much less saturated fat, lots of grains, beans, legumes. They're active and other sorts of things. They have much lower heart disease. So that was baked into the federal dietary guidelines. However, turns out that was a 22-country study. The other countries didn't support the thesis. They just published the 7 countries that did. And before the federal dietary guidelines, it was pretty much common knowledge. If you wanted to lose weight, you reduce starches. You ate less rice, ate less potatoes, cut back on bread. That was standard practice from the Banting diet in the 1800s, the Atkins diet in the U.S., which drew from earlier diets. Gary Taubes writes about this. But so the history of what foods are healthy, which aren't, were co-opted or distracted by federal intervention in the bodily energy business, the food energy business, similar to the intervention in the economic energy for our cars and houses now. And just briefly on the theory, I encourage you to read on this on your own. The government has what they call the energy balance theory of obesity, that if you're overweight, it's because you're eating too much and you're not exercising enough. So the doctor would say, you need to just eat a little less, exercise a little more. Critics say that doesn't work. It's the wrong theory. It's a thermodynamic theory. It matters what you eat, but it matters more what you metabolize, what your body burns, and your resting metabolic rate. This energy balance theory is flawed, and this publication describes the history of it, how this fatally, tragically flawed paradigm derailed the science of obesity. So as your doctor and nutritionist is telling you just need to eat a little less, exercise more to lose weight, that drives people crazy. That's the basis of Weight Watchers and other sorts of dietary things that don't work. I mean, the new drugs don't work long-term either, I'll argue. But why doesn't energy balance work? And some people do it, and it seems to work for them. So it's not that it doesn't work for anybody, because we're all different. But I mean, my recollection, whenever I felt I was getting heavy, I had a special pair of pants I would put on that were bigger, and then I didn't feel like I was getting heavy. But when I was gaining weight, I thought, well, I need to just eat a little less and exercise more. But within a few days, I was in a panic. It didn't work for me. Turns out people can lose 5, 10, 15 pounds in a month by eating less and exercising more, working out harder. But what happens is that signals your body to think that there's not enough food, that you're starving. Your body automatically downregulates your metabolism so that you conserve energy. So all of a sudden, the diet that allowed you to lose 10 pounds last month, eating the same thing the next month, you might gain a few pounds and feel miserable and cold all the time, because your body is saying, okay, it looks like there's not enough food, we better conserve. Now, instead, if your weight gain is caused by a hormone problem, you shouldn't do this. And the argument is you can lose weight, the importance of eating saturated fat like an egg. It's hard to eat too many eggs. You eat and then you're full and you're not hungry for a long time. So obesity is not an energy balance problem, but instead a hormone problem, particularly insulin. And so the challenge is when you eat grains, sugar, grains, dessert, processed foods, bread, that turns to glucose in your system. Your body can only hold a little bit of glucose, 3 teaspoons, I guess, in your bloodstream. After that, your blood glucose goes up. And so your body, pancreas, releases insulin, and the insulin's job is to get that glucose out of your bloodstream before it kills you. So some of it goes into your muscles as glycogen. If you're exercising, you're burning off some of it. Some of it goes into liver, you can build up fatty liver, and then it's pushed into your cells as fat. Over time, even though your blood glucose looks okay on tests, it turns out your insulin is pushing more and more to get that excess glucose out of your bloodstream, and that gradually leads to insulin resistance. So that's the problem, according to Ben Bickman and others, that insulin is the core problem, insulin and inflammation. And that's caused by the food you eat. And it's not a question of trying to diet by eating a little bit less and exercise more. It's eating different foods that don't spike your glucose. That's why a continuous glucose monitor can be helpful. But, I'm just talking on this. You can fast forward, but read the article, read this stuff. These are leading people. David Lubick at Harvard, Eric Westman at Duke, Mark Hyman at Cleveland Clinic, Stephen Finney at Virta Health. Leading metabolic researchers are saying it's a carbohydrate insulin problem, not an energy balance problem. But the federal government, the food pyramid, the American Diabetes Association, the American Heart Association, these institutions, critics say, are captured by by big carb, by the grain industry, by the processed food industry, influenced by sugar, by the pharma industry. They fund the nutrition departments. So nutrition people who say, look, for a healthy diet, you need to eat, 7 helpings of grain a day and grain and snacks all day long. Others say, when I was a kid, we had dinner at 6. We didn't eat again until 7 in the morning or 8 in the morning. So we had a natural fast. We broke it with breakfast. We didn't have snacks through the day. We had breakfast, lunch, and dinner. We didn't have snacks. And did we get hungry? Sure. But the argument is by advocates of time-restricted eating that our digestive system needs a rest. We shouldn't eat right before we sleep. We should get a good night's sleep. What we eat and when we eat matter more, but the current dietary guidelines say you need to eat a lot. You need to eat a lot of carbs. That doesn't work for most people, which is why most people are metabolically ill. They're overweight, they're unhealthy, they have high blood pressure. So I write about this. How do we get Americans healthy again? And again, citing this public research. The federal government has funded studies for decades, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars spent trying to find support for the energy balance theory, for saturated fats being bad. They haven't been able to support that. You could argue they've suppressed the studies that showed the opposite. But again, as a debater, you want to see both. And I'm arguing this should be a debate topic. You don't rely on me to tell you what to eat or when to eat, but do your own research and read the advocates for reform, read the people who defend the status quo, see who's got the best data, the best arguments. Switching back to energy, how do we, speaking of juice, the title of this on the importance of the grid and electricity, federal dietary guidelines say eat a lot of juice. Don't drink Coca-Cola, eat orange juice and apple juice. Critics say don't eat juice. It spikes your blood glucose. It's full of fructose and glucose. Eat an orange where you've got fiber that slows the glycemic load so you don't have this boom of blood glucose. Don't eat a lot of fruit. Eat fruit in season. Don't eat tropical fruits unless you're in the tropics because they've got so much glucose and fructose in them, much more than they used to. But this is an overhead of juice electricity. I encourage the documentary. Poor people around the world are poor because they don't have access to electricity. Current federal policy is trying to further restrict access to electricity around the world because it's funding the energy transition, wind and solar, and trying to restrict funding for fossil fuels, natural gas, that would provide low-income people with access to electricity. So this is a world issue that's discussed some in here. I would argue federal energy policy that's restricting access to electricity around the world through U.S. aid and other controls is bad policy. But powering the unplugged, we want to overcome the barriers to electrification in the developing world. Poverty around the world, again, why are people poor? Access to electricity, to telecommunications, to transportation is a key part of poverty around the world. And U.S. policy at least shouldn't be in the way of that, at least shouldn't be restricting that. Energy, again, we're exploring. We don't know what the best source. Here's a whole pile of text because I forgot to put it line by line. But energy economics, just like food and nutrition research a question of incentives, information, and trade-offs. We don't know the best way to produce energy.